I'm Captain Andy Webb with the 2nd Kentucky Calvary. We're a reenactment group in Southern California that portrays the 2nd Kentucky Company B, part of the Orphan Brigade under the command of General John Hunt Morgan in the Confederate States of America. A lot of reenactors are here for different reasons, but probably most of us are here to portray history that is not taught in regular school. And so many people believe that the war between the states, or we like to call the War of Northern Aggression, or the War of Northern Treachery, a lot of people are taught that this is over slavery. And while slavery did play a part in it, it was not the reason why most rank and file soldiers were fighting in the war. For example, many Kentuckians fought to defend their state against northern aggression and federalization of state property and private property. And in my case, I actually had ancestors in the war, and they had their sheep ranch taken and were forced to sell their sheep for Union scrip. Well, that didn't set well, and my family weren't slaveholders, and neither were most of the people that fought in the Kentucky Brigade.
My own family fought in the war. My great-grandfather and his brother were farmers just north of Lynchburg. Lynchburg was a training, staging, and supply depot for the Army of Northern Virginia. Both of them paid the $300 bounty to get out of the war, and my great-grandfather's nephew, his brother's son, fought in the war. He fought with the 58th Virginia Regiment, the Johnson Guard, Company D. He survived the war. He survived being wounded at Fredericksburg. He survived a year of incarceration after being captured in Spotsylvania on the steps of the courthouse, and was released in Elmira, New York in 1865 in the summer, when the Attorney General ordered all the Confederate prisoners to be released. But he didn't sign up when South Carolina fired on Fort Sumter, and he didn't sign up when Virginia rattled its saber and seceded from the Union. But when the state was invaded a few months later by Union troops, that's when my ancestor went to fight. And my family were farmers. We didn't own slaves, but we still fought, because in this case, to him, it didn't matter. His grandfather fought invaders that wore red jackets. To him, the color of the jacket was irrelevant. There was an invading army coming into his state, and that's why he fought.
Lincoln, he is considered the emancipator, but it was a political move and not a move of necessarily morality. Lincoln's attitudes on slaves were he would rather send them back to Africa, which of course is how the country of Liberia was created prior to Lincoln, and Lincoln wanted to continue that effort to repatriate black Africans to the African continent. Lincoln also had family by marriage who were slave owners. Mary Todd, her family, they were somewhat of an aristocratic family, and they were slave owners. In fact, Mary Todd had a brother, I believe, who was a colonel, I believe, in the Confederate infantry or Confederate Army. So the idea of Lincoln wanting to free the slaves was not necessarily accurate. In fact, at one point when in the war, Lincoln said, I'm paraphrasing, one country without slaves, one country with slaves, it doesn't matter. It's all about keeping the Union together. It wasn't about freeing the slaves as one country free of slaves. On that note, it's interesting to know that I mentioned General John Hunt Morgan. It's interesting to know that Morgan was not considered well within the aristocracy, because Morgan considered black men, fierce and loyal fighters, and he had black men fighting within the 2nd Kentucky as equals to troopers in the unit. And that was prior to any northern unit forming with segregated unit. But so the 2nd Kentucky was an integrated unit of black men and white men fighting together for the cause, and the cause being states' right and freedom.
Well, I think his concern wasn't necessarily for the slaves, but in preserving the Union. Because if you think about it, the Emancipation didn't come out until '63. So for 2 years, he was conscripting, and he was asking for volunteers, and the slogan at the recruiting station was "Preserve the Union." It's one thing to preserve a Union if your state's being invaded, and you have to go to war because if you don't, this army's going to march across your farm and burn your home. It's different if you have to march hundreds of miles from where you live to train, and then march 1,000 miles or more into another state to fight. Why would you do that? To preserve the Union? To me, that doesn't seem like it's a good enough reason, and that's why I believe they started conscripting. When the Emancipation came out, there was a huge influx of African American enlistees. I believe 180,000 African Americans enlisted after the Emancipation came out. And that and the end of the prisoner exchange program pretty much spelled doom for the Confederacy at that point, because we weren't replenishing the infantry. And Lee's army that started the war with 150,000 men only had 11,000 when they surrendered at Appomattox. So he lost 90% of his army during that 5-year campaign. But the North was continually resupplied.
Well, it's pretty clear that the war was fought over money, and that's what it was about. At the time of the Civil War, at the beginning of the Civil War, the cotton trade in 1860 dollars was approximately $4 billion. At the same time, the slave trade, which was still in existence, was approximately a $4 million slave trade. So this was the labor of which that produced the money, which was the cotton. And a big part of the cotton was export to Europe and the emerging industrial textile industry in North America, and of course, then again, as I mentioned, in Europe. So the federal government wanted to keep that textile, they wanted to keep the cotton in North America and keep the prices low to support the northern mills and the northern industry and restrict the export into Europe. The Europeans stood to profit from an independent South.
Well, I do know that early in the Civil War, when they were talking about freeing the slaves, that was one of the main reasons that got the South up in arms. And it wasn't so much the institution of slavery that got them up in arms, it was the fact that someone outside of their state was telling them how they had to do things. So it was different kind of fight for freedom. When we fought in the Revolution, we were fighting for freedom. But in the Civil War, it was a different kind of freedom. It was an entitlement, almost, by the Confederacy and the states in the South, because the institution of slavery had been there since the 1600s. And it was decided on, and already had been done by some of the northern states, to decide on the legality of slavery. But it's odd that when Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation came out, that it only affected the slaves that the states that held slaves that were in the Confederacy, the 11 states that succeeded. The border states of Missouri and Delaware and Maryland and Kentucky all were firmly in the Union. They were occupied by Union armies and used as staging points on both campaigns, into Virginia on the east and into Tennessee along the rivers on the west, early in the war. And those states weren't given a choice, really. Some of them weren't allowed to vote on it. the city of Baltimore had their Second, Fourth, and Fifth Amendment rights suspended, which I believe is the right to protest, the right to keep and bear arms, and the right to decide, you know, what your laws are going to be, not dictated to you by the government. So during the war, Abraham Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which basically says no American citizen may be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. But that didn't happen. Baltimore citizens had their guns taken away. They weren't allowed to assemble, and their lawmakers were incarcerated without charges and not released for 4.5 months. In the meanwhile, an interim government was appointed by the federal government for that state. And to this day, I believe Maryland is the only state flag that still flies the color of the English noblemen that settled the country, as compared to a state or federal issued seal, which every other state in the Union has. It's Maryland's way of telling the federal government, this is our neener back at you for not giving us the right to decide as a state what we want to happen. So I find that odd.